Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It is my great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to you all who have joined from around the world. Before we begin, I would like to remind the audience to keep their microphones on mute. Please feel free to turn on your cameras so we can see each other and feel community spirit. My name is Soo-Hyun Kim, and I am the Youth Focal Point in the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, leading the Youth for Disarmament Initiative. UN Youth for Disarmament is an outreach initiative established in 2019 to engage, educate, and empower young people with the aim of facilitating their meaningful and inclusive participation in the field of disarmament and nonproliferation. I'm delighted to be part of today's event to launch the What If Spesterra Youth Video Challenge, asking young people to share their vision in response to one single question. What do you think the world would look like if more money was spent on peace and development and less on arms? Today, we are also having a panel discussion exploring how disarmament and young people contribute to a safer, more secure, and sustainable world. Without further ado, I would like to invite Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, Undersecretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, to deliver her opening remarks. Ms. Nakamitsu, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sue. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and dear friends, it is my great pleasure to greet all of you around the world. What a fantastic occasion. And of course, I'd like to first extend my sincere gratitude to Ambassador Cho Hyun, Permanent Representative of the Republic of Korea, Ambassador Marita Chan Barbere of Costa Rica, and of course, my good friend Jaithuma, who will be sending from Sri Lanka a video message. She's the UN Secretary General's envoy on youth. And I'm also very happy to welcome distinguished panelists from the Reverse the Trend, Scrap Weapons, and Humanium Metal, as well as our own UN Youth Champion for Disarmament. So today, we gather during the annual Global Days of Action on Military Spending, which fall this year in the International Year of Peace and Trust, as declared by the UN General Assembly. And this year also opens a decade of action, as you know, to achieve the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Now, finally, today is also World Arts Day. To celebrate all these occasions, the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs is launching the What If Spesterra Youth Video Challenge for young people to explore how disarmament contributes to a safer, more secure and sustainable world for all. And something important, we coined the word Spesterra from the Latin words for hope and land. This video challenge is built around one question. What do you think the world would look like if more money was spent on peace and development and less on arms? We invite young people everywhere to imagine a world without weapons of mass destruction, where conventional arms are strictly regulated and resources are directed to benefit people and the planet. The connection between disarmament and development is, of course, well established. This relationship has been recognized since the United Nations founding. The UN Charter actually contains a commitment to the least diversion of world resources to armaments. And in its very first resolution, as you know, the UN General Assembly called for the elimination of nuclear weapons and other weapons adaptable to mass destruction. So in other words, the aim of restraining military spending in favor of development and eliminating all weapons of mass destructions are both in the DNA, if you will, of the United Nations. The link between security and development also features in the 2030 Agenda and its Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs recognize that weak systems of social and economic support threaten the rights and safety of individuals and communities, as well as, of course, the security of states. Small arms and light weapons are the most common enablers of armed violence. They kill nearly 250,000 people each year, more than 1/3 of all violent deaths. We save lives when we reduce illicit weapon flows and better protect and manage stockpiled arms and ammunition. These steps are also key to achieving the SDGs. About 1 year ago, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for an immediate global ceasefire to help tackle COVID-19, create opportunities for diplomacy and life-saving aid, and give hope to people suffering in conflict zones. But unfortunately, as we all know, conflicts continue to rage across the globe and military spending is mounting. In 2019 alone, it approached $2 trillion, almost $250 for every person on the planet. And all this spending makes us all less safe, not more. Reining in this runaway spending is essential to rebuilding successfully from the pandemic, especially with women often carrying more of its societal burdens. For 75 years, the world has lived in the shadow of nuclear catastrophe. With climate change, nuclear weapons represent, as you know, one of the two potentially existential threats to humanity. Through luck and leadership, these weapons have not been used since 1945. But today, the danger that a nuclear weapon will be used again is as great as the risk we faced during the Cold War. And the only way to eliminate nuclear risks is to eliminate nuclear weapons themselves. To invest in disarmament and arms control is to invest directly in a peaceful and secure future where sustainable development can flourish. By helping others understand this, we will make the world safer, more prosperous, and better prepared to tackle 21st century challenges. So young people are leaders in building inclusive, diverse coalitions and for empowering dialogue that results in transformative actions. We look to young people like you, like those joining me today as participants and, of course, panelists, to be the ultimate force for change as national and, of course, world citizens, now and for future generations. So as we kick off the What If Spesterra Youth Video Challenge, I look forward to seeing our young participants envision what the world would look like if we put humanity at the center of our security efforts and use the tools of disarmament to build a safer, more prosperous world. Thank you very much, and looking forward to all the conversations today. Back to you, Sue.
Thank you, Ms. Nakamitsu, for your inspiring words. Now, I would like to invite Ambassador Cho Hyun, Permanent Representative of the Republic of Korea to the United Nations, to give his remarks. Ambassador Cho, you have the floor.
Next generation leaders, young and brilliant minds, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. First, let me express my gratitude to USG Nakamitsu and her team for organizing this event and coming up with this great catchphrase of Spesterra. Well, it has been a long and cold winter for all. Spring has come and there are signs of recovery, but we keep our memories of the past year with a heavy heart. COVID-19 has also shown us, however, the importance of our agenda for disarmament and non-proliferation. Indeed, the pandemic sent us a warning that we need to act now to protect people from the dangers to come. And the threats of a new arms race are as real and as potentially destructive as the ongoing pandemic. However, the takeaways from the pandemic are not only retrospective, but also prospective. It is also embodied by the name of this event. We have seen this time again, especially in the darkest moments of history. Humanity has proven its power to re-emerge both stronger and wiser. And youth is the agent of all values that we desperately need for us to build back better. The power of resilience, empathy, innovation, and relentless drive, and this is the power of youth who will change the world. Well, as for us, it was also the case with Korean youth. Despite, and maybe because of, the enormous challenges in Korea, the Korean youth have become what they are today. Ladies and gentlemen, to increase youth engagement on disarmament and non-proliferation, we need to provide venues where the youth speak and lead. In this regard, Korea, alongside the UN ODA, has been supporting various youth outreach and empowerment initiatives. This fall, Korea will also table a resolution on youth and disarmament for the second time since 2019. Championing the youth and disarmament agenda, my government will continue to support more inclusive participation of the youth on key disarmament and non-proliferation discussions. I look forward to visions of the youth being shared through the Youth Video Challenge today. And may I urge you to continue your active engagement in this important field moving forward. Thank you, Sue.
Thank you, Ambassador Cho. The Republic of Korea's strong and generous support for the Youth for Disarmament initiative is highly appreciated. Now, I would like to invite Ambassador Maritza Chan of the Permanent Mission of Costa Rica to the UN to give her remarks. Ambassador Chan, you have the floor.
Good morning, and thank you for being here today. When the UN was founded 76 years ago, it was born on the premise of a huge aspiration to save the succeeding generations from the scourge of war. The founding members of the UN knew their goal was audacious, but they dared to imagine the ultimate what if. What if there was a way that we could truly strive together to save ourselves once and for all from the horrors of war? In the decades since, we have worked tirelessly to sustain peace and build prosperity and security for all. The UN is a place where stakeholders can work together to establish common goals and common standards that enable peaceful relationships and peaceful societies to flourish. It is a place where we continuously ask ourselves, what if there is a better way to make us all feel safe and secure? We also come to know through experience that a negotiated peace can only be the beginning of what it means to be truly secure. Indeed, there can never be freedom from the scourge of war while people remain trapped in poverty and ill health. While young people are denied education, respect, and access, while women continue to be excluded from peace process and science, while communities live in fear of global warming that threatens farms and cities, industries, and homes. There can never be freedom from the scourge of war, while we have failed to fully commit to nuclear disarmament and verifiable regulations on weapons productions and trade, while we have failed to maintain progress on the 2015 Sustainable Development Goals, our common planet-shifting goals, and while we continue to ignore the promise contained in Article 26 of the UN Charter. Article 26 of the UN Charter must be our mantra. What we have come to understand is that the UN needs to be a place far more than the one that compels people to put down their weapons. The UN must be a place that enables a world in which people do not feel compelled to pick up weapons to begin in the first place. However, these aspirationals, what if we could eliminate poverty? What if we could educate every child, continually run against the working reality of global politics and global inequality? For better and for worse, the mechanisms of the UN are deeply embedded in global realpolitik. And oftentimes we see that it is too easy for some UN member states to pay lip service to the ideals of collective peace and prosperity, while also fortifying their border defenses and building their military might. And if we take anything away from the experience of the global COVID-19 pandemic, it must surely be that we have allowed our priorities to become further confused. Because we should have learned from this year that there is no level of military might that can save us from the deficits in health and other basic human needs. There are few weapons that can match the destructive power of a warming planet or a global pandemic. So let the experience of the last year be a lesson to us all. Let us begin a true reckoning our efforts to build peaceful and inclusive societies. Let us ask, what if we truly focus our collective efforts on uplifting the most vulnerable among us, instead of arming ourselves against the consequences of our failures to do so? As we begin this What If Spesterra event, I urge you to help us think deeply about the tools that we already have at our disposal, to consider the treaties, plans, proposals, and goals that we have already put in place, and to consider the potential outcome of these efforts if we could only put aside our political grandstanding and our weapons addictions in the service of genuine peace and security. This generation of youth is the largest in human history. In this regard, Costa Rica recognizes the work of the Office of Disarmament Affairs is conducting to engage, educate, and empower young people through its Youth for Disarmament initiative, e-newsletters, training programs, and dedicated youth website. Costa Rica applauds ODA's commitment to form meaningful collaborations to allow younger people to test their skills in a respectful and accessible environment. Costa Rica also recognizes our need for our political and social leadership to get younger, more diverse, more attentive to the values and aspirations of generations now and those to come, and more sensitive to the unique constellations of obstacles and limitations from pandemics, violence, poverty, inequality, lack of opportunities and displacements to climate change, the millions of young people face in all corners of the world. But all of this will likely bear fruit only if we partner successfully with you to share fully in your visions, your ideas, your energies, your cultural context, your dedication to a more inclusive, greener, safer world. With you, we can practice that better way. The way of peace, which is sustainable, and prosperity in which all are able to share. That better way in which everyone every single person has a seat at the table. Thank you for being part of this conversation.
Thank you, Ambassador Chan, for your inspirational words. Costa Rica's leadership in pushing disarmament processes and promoting SDGs are exemplary. Now, I am pleased to share with you a video message from Sri Lanka by Ms. Jayathma Wickramanayake, UN Secretary General's Envoy on Youth.
Distinguished participants, it's my pleasure to address all of you today on this important nexus between peace and development. My name is Jayathma Wickramanayake and I am the United Nations Secretary General's Envoy on Youth. I would like to start by thanking the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs for creating this important and interactive platform to discuss the synergies between disarmament and development. Year 2021 was declared by the United Nations General Assembly as the International Year of Peace and Trust, providing us with the ideal opportunity to reflect on the true meaning of peace and what is needed to sustain it. The Sustainable Development Agenda makes it clear that there cannot be development without peace and security. Disarmament and arms control are essential to creating these conditions, and young people have a key role to play. Youth across the world have demonstrated tremendous resilience while efficiently adjusting their disarmament efforts to meet the emerging challenges of COVID-19. No number of weapons protected populations from the pandemic. On the contrary, the UN Secretary General launched a call for global ceasefire to put a stop to ongoing violence and conflicts while calling for universal solidarity. So I encourage everyone to join this mission to strive towards a world free of conflict and violence and nuclear weapons that cast an existential shadow over humanity. Young people under the age of 30 account to over half of the world's population, and we cannot achieve world peace without their participation. Therefore, I challenge all young people to reflect on this question. What do you think the world would look like if more money was spent on peace and development and less on arms? Since your answer is ready, I invite you to participate in the What If Spesterra Youth Video Challenge organized by ODA. I also encourage you to be creative and use innovative approaches to showcase your vision of what the world would look like if we put people at the center of our disarmament efforts to save lives and make our world a safer place. I look forward to learning more about your creative approaches, and I wish you all an interactive and insightful event. Thank you.
The scenery of the Youth Envoy's video message is a nice prelude into What If Spesterra Youth Video Challenge. Before we officially launch the challenge, once again, I would like to thank Ms. Nakamitsu, Ambassador Cho, Ambassador Chan, and Ms. Wickramanayake for their active participation and support. Now, it's my greatest honor and pleasure to launch the What If Spesterra Youth Video Challenge with a public service announcement featuring UN Messenger of Peace Michael Douglas and UN Youth Champions for Disarmament.
Disarmament is at the heart of what we do at the United Nations, with our goal to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war.
2021 is the International Year of Peace and Trust. The importance of establishing and maintaining international peace and security has never been greater. And young people have the power to help build a safer, more secure world for all of us, for future generations. So what is the What If Spesterra Youth Video Challenge? Spesterra is coined from the Latin word spes, which means hope, and terra, which means land. The Youth Video Challenge is open to young people from 18 to 24 years old, Entries will be accepted until July 15th, 2021.
This year, we want to know what you think the world would look like if more money were spent on peace and development and less on weapons.
It could feed more people.
I think we could spend more on schools and education.
Whatever your ideas are, we want to hear them.
All you need to do is record a 2-minute, 20-second video and share your voice.
Please visit youth.disarmament.org and submit your video. It's simple.
It takes all of us to secure our common future.
All of us.
Our voices are more important now than ever. Share your voice now and join us to build a safer, more peaceful, and sustainable world for all.
I would like to call on many young people attending today's event to take up the Spesterra video challenge, which is open to youth from 18 to 24 years old. I also invite everyone, regardless of age, to join us in encouraging youth to share their creative vision for a more peaceful and sustainable world. You can find a social media toolkit to spread the word about the video challenge on the Youth for Disarmament website. The link is provided in the chat by my colleague Mary Kate Monahan. Now, I would like to turn to my colleague Catherine Priseman, Political Affairs Officer in the Conventional Arms Branch of the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, who will moderate the panel discussion. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I apologize for that short delay. I couldn't unmute myself. These days, you never know what new technological challenges will arise. But very good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. It's really my pleasure to be here with you today. And I would like to thank, of course, High Representative Ms. Nagamitsu and also Sue and my colleagues for inviting me to join in this discussion. That was the first time I saw the Spesterra video, so I was experiencing it with you, and it's really fantastic. It's so great to see these kinds of creative campaigns when often us as desk officers are sort of immersed in the minutia. So it's nice to take a step back and see how youth and the public can really engage with us on these important issues. So my pleasure to be here with you and greet you and to facilitate a very interesting discussion that we will have today with a range of very diverse voices to address some of these key questions that have already been touched upon by Ms. Nagamitsu and Ambassador Cho and of course Ambassador Chan. And we'll explore a bit more, but importantly hearing from voices from the youthful generation, as it were, to see how we can answer this question: what if more money were spent on peace and development and less on weapons? And it's really quite apropos that we have the event today. It's usually U.S. tax day. It was delayed because of COVID-19, but usually around this time, at least for me sitting in New York, we think about the millions and trillions of dollars that flow through the government, and such a large share of it is spent on defense and weapons and war. And so we often take this time in April to take a step back and to think about where is this money going, and to get back to what Maritza importantly underscored, Article 26 of the UN Charter, which is a global commitment that all of our governments have made to the least diversion of the world's resources to armaments. So before I give the floor to our panelists today, I wanted just to remind you of some of the guiding questions that we have that all of our panelists will comment on in their own way, bringing in particular their perspective from their organizations and the work that they're doing and how their organizations are contributing and working towards a world with the least diversion of resources to armaments. But as has already been pointed out by our opening remarks, the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda makes clear that there can be no development without peace and security. And disarmament is integral to that peace and security. And it's in the DNA, as Ms. Nakamitsu said, of the United Nations. So with that in mind, the question is, what should the international community prioritize, in particular in this COVID-19 challenging environment, to build back better? Ambassador Cho referenced this as well. What needs to change and how? How can your organization, I'm speaking to the panelists here, can your organization help the international community confront these challenges we face, not only COVID-19, but the lives and livelihoods that are currently being affected by weapons and conflict? And we know that despite the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire, which was March 23rd of 2020, sort of the tough of the COVID-19 pandemic, he called for a cease of all conflict to allow for the diplomatic space for peace and to enable the essential humanitarian aid delivery, particularly in the COVID-19 environment. And we know that this has not been entirely successful. We continue to see conflict raging. So how can we as an international community, but also your organization, help to confront these challenges? And of course, looking particular at the Spesterra campaign and the Youth for Disarmament campaign, what can the youthful generation, I think we're all a bit youthful in our minds, but what can the younger generations do to secure our common future? And what do you think the barriers are for youth participating in disarmament related discussions, which are often seen as sort of very serious and sort of inaccessible? And finally, looking to the future, what do you think we can and what can we do to make sure that more money is spent on peace and development and less on arms? So with this, thank you for indulging me. We will turn to our first panelist, Miss Lovely Umayam from Reverse the Trend. And Lovely is a writer and a nuclear policy expert. So we've been speaking a lot about in context of conventional weapons and conflict, but also we of course continue to be concerned about the amount of money spent on nuclear weapons programs and nuclear proliferation. So Lovely will speak to us from that perspective. And she's also the founder of the Bombshell Toe Policy and Arts Collective. So today she's speaking on behalf of Reverse the Trend, an arts, education, and advocacy program engaging youth affected by nuclear weapons legacy and climate change, which, as we said, is really one of the primary existential threats to us today. So Lovely, over to you. And thank you so much for being here and offering us about a 10-minute intervention if you can. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Catherine, for that wonderful introduction. So distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I am grateful for the opportunity to contribute to this event. Again, my name is Lovely Umayam, and I'm actually speaking to you from Los Angeles, California. And I first want to share my gratitude to the Tongfa, Quiche, Gabrielino, and Chumash, which are the native communities who are the original custodians of this land I've come to call home. And I'd like to really start by saying that any genuine dialogue about peace and security requires what I'm calling real talk. And this is really in pondering all of the questions that Catherine posed. One thing that just really stuck to my mind is really the who, right? We talked about the how and the what, but to me, it's really who gets to participate in building a more peaceful world, and who gets to lead us to Spesterra. The fact of it, and as Catherine also already mentioned, that if we want to achieve this beautiful future, there's so many systematic barriers blocking some critical players in joining us in this journey. So what I really want to offer moving forward is to think deeply on who these players are and how we can invite them. And to that, I'm actually going to share a personal story. So please bear with me since this may be a little different. So for the past 10 years, I've really dedicated my life to researching nuclear nonproliferation, arms control, and disarmament. I've done this in the capacity of government, academia, and the NGO community. And because of this work, I've been exposed to all forms of knowledge about nuclear weapons in the form of textbooks, presidential memoirs, international treaties, and technical papers. I've studied and read them all. But because of my career, I always get questions about who do I look up to in the field? Who are my role models? Who keeps me invested in this work? And while I have a number of amazing and generous mentors, I have to be honest and say that I don't get my inspiration from politicians or even other nuclear experts. Rather, I'm really inspired by artists. My role models include James Baldwin, Zadie Smith, Joan Didion, John Hersey. The list of writers go on for me. And as someone who grew up in a creative community in Los Angeles, where my closest friends and family members are writers, dancers, painters, I've really come to trust the artist's voice because their words feel the most true. And so one of my favorite poets actually is Marilyn Nelson, who taught poetry and meditation at the West Point Military Academy. It's a very unique course. And she once said that poetry opens people up to the otherness that exists in them. It operates in a different plane of understanding where words and meaning really sink into the bone. And I think we've all experienced this when we read our favorite book, when we see a breathtaking sculpture, or watch a really good film. It's not just about the transmission of facts, but also giving space for the body to absorb and react in a soulful way. So there are actually two poets that made me the nuclear expert I am today. And so the first I want to share is Chilean diplomat poet Pablo Neruda, who wrote this poem called Oda al Atomo, or Ode to the Atom. And he wrote this in 1954. And I'll just give you the first several lines of his poem. So it starts off as, "Tiniest star, you seem to be buried forever in things, you devilish fire occult. One day, someone knocked you at your minuscule door, and it was man." And, you know, it's a beautiful poem, and I really urge you all to look it up and read it. But to me, Neruda was able to articulate two paths for the atom, a weaponized one or a peaceful one. And I was in early college when I read this poem, and I was not even pursuing a career in nonproliferation yet, but I was immediately intrigued by this duality. So in hindsight, Neruda was the person who taught me about the peaceful uses of the atom before I even read Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech. And then the second poem I want to share is by this Maori poet. His name is Hone Tufare, and the poem is called No Ordinary Sun, which tells the story of a single tree sort of surrendering to a nuclear explosion. And here are two lines from his poem. "Tree, let your naked arms fall, nor extend in vain entreaties to the radiant ball." And if you read the entire poem, there is this unbearable sadness and loss encapsulated in Tufare's words that no policy recommendation can express. And this is what I mean by real talk. You know, sometimes it's not led by facts and figures, but it forges an emotional connection that really holds us accountable as humans. So linking this back to Spesterra, again, my question that I really gravitated to is, who do we invite in this journey? And I believe that we can't reach Spesterra, we can't build back better without the language of the arts. A poem might not hold all the answers to establish policy, but it has a power that a 30-page report will never have. Art is a way to bust down gatekeeping. To me, it's a liberatory force. It's a universal invite for anyone to dream and think differently. And at this point in my career, art has actually reinvigorated my work in many ways that I have not anticipated. For the past several years, I've had the great privilege of facilitating these creative writing workshops under this initiative called Reverse the Trend, which engages youth affected by nuclear weapons production and climate change. And I did not approach this project as a nuclear expert, but as a writer. And through Reverse the Trend, I've had the opportunity to write poetry with Marshallese youth. And I am so proud and humbled to call them my friends and colleagues. And I've learned so much about their tradition and lived experience that have been harmed firsthand by nuclear weapons testing and the intensifying natural disasters that threaten their homeland. And I would say that their intergenerational knowledge cannot be found in a textbook or technical paper. It has to be earned through relationship building, and writing together, making art together gave us that bond. And again, it doesn't mean that they're all going to be poets now. Many of them actually want to be teachers. But the point of this creative process is to allow space for compassion and empathy and humanity. And they in turn can apply that to whatever they want to be in the future. So to just close my opening remarks, I just want to emphasize that for me, Spesterra is about embracing different expressions of knowledge that the current people on this stage, including myself, might not have the ability to fully articulate. I think it requires an access and transfer of power to allow others to lead the way. If we invest less on arms, we must reallocate these resources to community work and creative work that will serve as a drawbridge to allow new people in, especially young people who have never dreamed of doing peace and security work in their life. And so Spesterra is really a world where these young people are given agency so that they can gain confidence in becoming our future diplomats, scientists, teachers, and maybe even poets. And that's a world that I would be blessed to live in. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lovely. First of all, you were precisely 10 minutes. So you may be an artist, but you have a scientific precision. But no, thanks so much for your reflections. I think it's important to talk about the role of art in what can be seen often as a very technical, scientific space, and how art can speak to us often much more loudly than policy papers and figures and facts. So I'm sure that resonated with many participants today. So I will now turn to Ms. Kirsten Mosey, who is one of our UN Youth Champions for Disarmament. You probably recognize her from the video. Kirsten is one of the 10 champions for disarmament that we have in the Office for Disarmament Affairs. And she's currently entering her 4th year of university at the University of Waterloo in Canada. And she's interested in pursuing studies in the areas of forced migration and security. So Kirsten, we look forward to your reflections, including thinking about how some of your own research between displacement and arms proliferation and the impact in particular on vulnerable people, how that links into what we can do, and in particular what youth can do in the context of Spesterra. So over to you. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much. It's so great to be here, and I am among incredibly impressive companies. So I feel very grateful for this opportunity. First, I want to touch on this point of how do we build back better? When I think about this year of COVID, in my short lifetime, a year feels like a really long time, and the vulnerabilities that it has exposed and the way that it's really made young people, and I think people in general, aware of global inequalities in a way that we might not have been before is really amazing. So when we look at what COVID has done, of course, the massive death toll, the massive illness, all these strains on healthcare systems, a lot of what it has done as well is expose who is the most vulnerable and what these communities need to be able to live a sustainable, safe, and meaningful life. So when you look at these vulnerable communities, we know that they're communities who are usually, lower income, low access to healthcare, low access to sustainable housing and clean water, and things that are really just basic human rights. So when we talk about building back better and envisioning a world in this kind of post-COVID era, we really need to be looking at what these vulnerable communities need to be able to not just thrive in a COVID world, but outside of it as well. And I look at, a lot of different communities. My personal experience is working with refugees in refugee and displacement camps. And you look at many of these communities, and again, my experience is in the island of Lesbos, Greece, where people are overcrowded. They are living in completely unsanitary conditions. They don't have access to clean water. They don't have access or the ability to social distance. And you see all of these factors, and you have to ask yourself, why are people in this position? Because it's never something that exists in a vacuum. So you look at the vulnerable communities that COVID has affected, and you have to take a step back and look at these root causes. And this is something that through my degree and through my work with the Youth Champions and my other internship research work, that the idea of systemic change is absolutely key to anything that youth can do, because we have to understand that everything's connected. So when we're talking about building back better, we're talking about implementing systems that address core and root causes. And when we're talking about that in the context of weapons and arms proliferation, we of course have to look at the effects of war and conflict on people's abilities to live a sustainable lifestyle. So we look at people again in these refugee and displacement camps, and they're fleeing oftentimes because of war or because of the instability caused by war. And many of these conflicts might be decades long, they might be new, but the fact of the matter is that it's creating unsafe conditions where people need to flee home. And the reality of our world is that they're continuing in a really difficult circumstances, and it snowballs into new problems that we see with things like COVID-19. So I often encourage young people to be looking at these systemic changes and these root causes. And I think a really great example of this that we're seeing, a relevant example at least, is the impact of war on a place like Yemen, where one of the huge issues there is actually mass poverty, mass famine, mass displacement, and it's all caused by war. So if we're taking a step back and we're saying, why are people affected by COVID-19, or why are people living vulnerable lives? A lot of it has to do with the fact that we spend so much money on weapons, and we focus so much of our time and energy on fighting wars. And something that I absolutely have to point out is that the international community is deeply embedded in this system. Again, you look at a place like Yemen, it has lots of international involvement, both in the fighting and both in the aid. And what Yemen has shown us in other situations like that is that there's no amount of weapons that will save people in the way that aid will, in the way that reducing those weapons will, in the way that actually implementing sustainable systems will. So we have to talk about what's a sustainable change that can be made, and we have to go forward and look at that. So when I look at the ways that we can be making changes in this post-COVID world, I look at the fact that we need to stop funding weapons. We need to be putting those millions and billions, and in fact trillions of dollars into circumstances so that people can be building up their lives on sustainable development rather than living on just a survival basis. I think that's absolutely key. And again, when you look at these systemic issues, we have to talk about how to get people involved in it. So a big thing with this challenge is, how do you get young people involved? How do you get them excited about disarmament when there's so many other things going on in the world? And I think a huge barrier to young people getting involved in disarmament, or anyone really getting involved in disarmament, is a lack of awareness and education, and the fact that there's so much noise going around. So you need to take a step back and say, what are the issues that young people are passionate about, and how might they connect to disarmament or connect to this idea of a world without weapons? An example that came to mind for me, excuse me, was the fact that a lot of young people are really passionate about ensuring LGBTQ plus communities are safe and protected. And we know for a fact the presence of weapons in a community will make lives of LGBTQ people more vulnerable. So if we say we want a world where LGBTQ plus people are more valued and kept safe, we need a world without weapons. Similar for the issue of climate change. If we want a world going forward that is free from climate change, or that is free from the effects of climate change, we need to be abolishing nuclear weapons, because they will have a disastrous effect on the climate, as we've already seen with nuclear testing and in the past century. And you imagine all of these things, and it can get very overwhelming. And I think that's another barrier for young people, that it's really overwhelming. And there's a whole host of issues that come up when you think about all of the issues facing, my generation. There's a lot of anxiety moving forward. I think a huge part of the next step to getting young people involved is instilling measures of hope. So when we talk about the changes that can be made, a lot of young people, or especially people who are around my age, we've only ever known this world system. We've only ever known things as they are. And again, in my lifetime, 1 year of my short life has been spent in disarray with COVID-19. So it's really great to remind young people that the way things are right now is not how they have to be. And that even looking to our parents and our grandparents, their lives changed drastically over the course of the last century. Things changed drastically. Our world system changed drastically. And that means it can change again. And I think that's absolutely key for young people to understand, that things like abolishing nuclear weapons or getting rid of all weapons in general, or a world free from climate change, those are possible. And you know what? The world will change, and we can be a part of it if we really are focusing on that. So instilling that hope, rather than the doom and gloom of everything's going to hell, it's that things are possible and change is possible, and we can be a part of it. So then encouraging young people to use their voices. You focus on this education aspect. You have to have advocacy that's informed. So that's always the first step. And then young people can make this change. I think we look at things like the Fridays for Future strikes and Black Lives Matter protests and all of these mass movements, and we see that a lot of time, all that young people need is the information to take it forward and make their voices heard. So that's what I really encourage young people to do, is that if you make your voice loud enough, people will listen. And we talk about things like getting rid of weapons, and we talk about the fact that, there's little to no political will to actually do that. But when people create the conditions for demand, the governments have to listen, and political will follows those creation of demand. So I think a lot of it focuses on the fact that people need to be excited about this. They need to know that it's possible and desirable, and that they can make a change. And the last point I want to make is kind of this question of what would a world without weapons look like? And I think, again, if you focus on what is desirable and what is possible, and framing this question of all of this money spent on weapons and where else it could go, I think is really, really key. So we talk about the trillions of dollars spent every year on weapons. And the way we should really be framing that is that that's X number of hospitals spent on weapons. That's X number of schools spent on weapons. That's X number of people brought out of poverty or given healthcare, or given housing, spent on weapons. And that's an absolute crucial framework that we need to be focusing on, to remind people that we're spending money on weapons when we can be spending it somewhere else. And we've seen with COVID-19 the direct impact that being able to spend on things like personal protective equipment and ICU capacity and ventilators has on fighting a crisis. So spending money on sustainable development and many of the goals in the SDGs isn't just a good idea for COVID, but it has long-lasting effects after the fact. And I think, again, focusing back on the idealistic part of ourselves, that we need to have the ability to dream. So this challenge focuses on how it's the hope for the land. So what is the hope for the land? What is the things that young people want to see in the world? I want to see a world free from weapons. I do. I want to see the 80 million refugees around the world find a home. I want to see countries open their doors. I want to see a world system that prioritizes healthcare, that gives everyone vaccines, that really values the dignity of the person rather than the dignity of a weapon. And I don't think it's naive to say that. I don't think it's naive to say that in my lifetime, we will see dynamic change. We will see these lasting effects, and we will see young people leading this charge, because it can and it will happen. And that's really all I have here. I think that there's a lot more that can be said. I think that young people get so excited about all of these different issues and different topics, and they're actually really all connected. So let's take those fighting for climate change and we bring them into the scope of a world without weapons. Let's take those fighting for human rights and for dignity of the person and we bring them into a world without weapons, because it is all connected. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirsten, so much. I fully agree. I think us in the disarmament space, we so often find ourselves saying, a world free of nuclear weapons and strict control of conventional weapons is not utopian. It's concrete, it's achievable, it's real. So we have to continue with that line of messaging. I see Ms. Nakamitsu has had to leave for her next meeting, but she thanks everyone for their participation, in particular remarks by our younger participants. So on her behalf, I'll just pass that along. So thanks so much, Kirsten. And I also fully agree with this idea of leveraging different communities of people, and those of us who are feeling passionate about refugees or feeling passionate about climate change, all these things are really very much interconnected. And the framework that we have for that is the Sustainable Development Goals, I think, which ties all of these very critical issues together. And trying to be a peaceful, sustainable world requires action in all of these work streams. So thank you very much. So we will now move to Mr. Olamide Samuel, who is a research associate in nuclear politics at the University of Leicester, as well as a senior teaching fellow at SOAS, University of London in the UK. And he recently finished his tenure as coordinator of the Scrap Weapons Project, which is the strategic concept for the removal of arms and proliferation. And he remains active in that advisory board. He's also the facilitator of the African Union's Diaspora Youth Initiative, and he founded and convenes the Free Weapons Campaign. So lots of interesting experience and associations to inform his remarks here. So we look forward to hearing from you, Olamide, in particular, how you think we can fundamentally rethink the concept of security. This is something that our High Representative Nakamitsu has stressed, because this traditional notion of state security has to be rethought. How do we get from a traditional sense of posturing and militarization to prioritizing the human being? And what is human security? A security that's based in prioritization of the human being. How do we get to that? So we look forward to your reflections. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for that very generous introduction. And there's been some really inspiring contributions from some of the panelists today, and really glad to hear the different schools of thought on youth involvement in this field. So with regards to building back better from the COVID pandemic, I think that for sure the international community needs to fundamentally rethink the concept of security. And it's at two levels. So first of all, within states at present, something called state security is prioritized over human security to such an extent that in many countries, this prioritization itself of state security over human security is a threat to the security of populations within the country. So we find in many areas that in the name of national security, many states engage in repressive activities against their populations in the name of stability, in the name of preventing regime change. And so, if we fundamentally rethink what sort of security we aspire to, moving away from the more militarized notions of guns and bombs and bullets, and actually looking at the full range of threats that actually concern an individual human being, we begin to think about things like food security, water security, access to healthcare provision, those sorts of things that are much more real for individuals in populations. And I think that the COVID pandemic has really taught us that ignoring the wider threats to human security inevitably affects the very functioning of the state. You can't ignore the security concerns of the aggregate number of individuals and expect that a state will continue to be able to function as usual. Now, at a second level, I think we also need to reconceptualize security between states. And I think states need to prioritize cooperative and collaborative modes of interaction, as opposed to the confrontational behavior, including war, sanctions, and subversion, that which we routinely see, in order for them to be able to foster an environment where the reliance on military capability is reduced or at least outdated. And I think if we put more efforts towards multilateral cooperation, we are able to then focus on some of the most dire threats to human security, including pandemics, water insecurity, and climate change, as has been discussed today. And we need to recognize that these threats don't see the artificial constructs of borders and state sovereignty, and they can't be mitigated by unilateral action alone. Now, I've also prepared some remarks to answer some of the other questions that have been posed today. And so when we think about, for example, how lives and livelihoods are affected by weapons and conflict, I think we must understand that every sphere of social relations is affected by the outbreak of conflict, because conflict in itself is the breakdown of peaceful social interactions within and amongst peoples. And within this, I think the proliferation of illicit small arms and light weapons really complicates this problem. To be clear, as has been said by other panelists today, there are numerous drivers of conflict: economic dislocation, political exclusion, diminishing natural resources that exacerbate conflictual relationships, particularly in heterogeneous societies. However, the illicit proliferation of arms is a critical factor that determines the veracity of conflict. And so how my organization has helped in this particular regard is to link this crucial understanding of the role of arms to seeing a more peaceful world. But before I delve into the functionings of the different organizations I've worked for on this particular topic, I want to highlight some of the facts about the world we live in. And so, according to the Global Campaign on Military Spending, the annual nuclear weapons budget worldwide is 1,000% or 10 times the combined budget of both the United Nations and the World Health Organization. Also, according to figures from Oxfam International, it would only cost 0.7% of global military spending to vaccinate the world's 7.8 billion people against COVID-19. So, keeping these facts in mind, we really see the direct damage, the direct opportunity costs that our addiction to hyper-militarized versions of security mean in real time. And so I work in more than one organization which seeks sustainable solutions to armed conflict. On the one hand, I just recently finished my stint as coordinator on scrap weapons. And here we sought to encourage states to consider a more effective means of spending limited economic resources to combat the COVID pandemic. Through the Freeze Weapons campaign, we asked that states and corporations, individually and collaboratively, declare moratoriums, or basically pause the production, the trade, and the supply of weapons to free up the much needed resources to bolster healthcare provision and infrastructure. On the other hand, my work with the African Union Diaspora Youth Initiative, through the Silencing the Guns Beyond 2020 campaign, seeks to refocus the African Union's efforts on the guns. So within the Silencing the Guns campaign, a lot has been said about the drivers of conflict, which have been very valid, but very little has been said about the guns themselves. And so through this particular campaign, which is made up of young people that are equally motivated, our work highlights the importance of effective state control over the flow of licit and illicit weapons, and the importance of the Arms Trade Treaty universalization on the continent as the first step to reasonably achieve some of the milestones within the Silencing the Guns campaign. As I've said, oftentimes you can't silence what you can't see. And so it's my hope that better small arms and light weapons ammunition management on the continent would bolster other aspects of the Silencing the Guns initiative. If I do have a bit more time, I would also like to turn my attention to the practical barriers for young people trying to participate in disarmament. And in this regard, I think that the equitable representation of young people is an important factor to consider. Now, I believe strongly that youth should be effectively represented at all the major WMD and humanitarian disarmament forums. Otherwise, these arenas where critical decisions are routinely being made lack the perspectives and the interests of young people. When one looks at the barriers to effective participation of state parties themselves, we also have seen an established correlation between low-income countries and their underrepresentation at review conferences, intersessional meetings, and working groups. Even when the states are even represented, we see that the size, the capacity, and the gender balance of these states are less than optimal. Now, when you add the variable of youth participation into this mix, it really reveals that young people, especially from low-income countries, are far removed from the central disarmament fora. And I think that this has to change. Another issue with young representation in these spaces is that representatives, as has been said today, often lack the technical capacity to deeply engage with the issues under review. And I think that a significant cause of this issue has to do with the economy of participation. So oftentimes, most youth representatives work as volunteers, juggling either schoolwork or other employment elsewhere as a means to sustain their participation in disarmament. I think we need existing organizations, state parties, and civil society groups to invest more deliberately in creating jobs and professional roles reserved for young people. And these roles should permit the onboarding of non-experts to be able to learn on the job, as usually lengthy requirements of professional experience is a barrier which young people simply cannot overcome because they're usually in the very early stages of career development. Another flaw in the disarmament and wider spheres is the proliferation of unpaid internships. Now, while these internships are vital to the participation of young people, the fact that they are unpaid excludes a significant proportion of people who simply cannot afford to cater to travel, housing, and other requirements without remuneration. Now, finally, what I think we should do so more money is spent on peace and development. I think young people, we should be much more outspoken against excessive spending on arms and ammunition. We need to consistently highlight the opportunity costs of spending on arms. We need to develop educational material so that more and more people become aware of this illogic that foundationally underscores the arms trade. And I also think that young people are able and should be able to challenge decision makers and engage more actively with their peers to organize in ways in which we can have a platform to engage with decision makers, to have platforms that decision makers cannot ignore. And finally, I will definitely say that we should spend a lot of time researching the issues, learn about the issues as they develop, learn about the opportunity costs and the decisions being made, especially when it comes to arms trade, production, and supply. And I think if you spend more time on research, you're in a better position to challenge decision makers because governments have a way of justifying the status quo. They usually have a lot of resources available to challenge the logic of a disarmament or arms control campaign. And so you have to be prepared and knowledgeable enough to deal with these frivolous excuses whenever they arise. And I feel with these combination of skills, attention to advocacy, and organizing with peers, young people cannot be silenced in disarmament and arms control for anymore. I'll pause there for now, but thank you so much for the time to speak.
Thank you very much, Lamide. Very, very interesting reflections on barriers to participation, including unpaid internships, which I can definitely sympathize with. I had similar feelings. I'm sure I saw some heads nodding, so I think it's a shared experience. But also the comparisons that we can make with regards to the amount of spending on military components, defense, and then what that money could be used for. COVID-19 vaccinations, defeating malaria, things of this nature are always very striking and poignant, those sort of comparative statistics. And then finally, I also was glad you raised the African Union's Silencing the Guns initiative, which has been extended to 2030, which is also in line with the Sustainable Development Agenda. And, that's also a useful framework to think about how we bring together these different work streams for a conflict-free Africa, which is essentially what the commitment is for. And you mentioned weapons and ammunition management, which is very important because we know that diversion from stockpiles causes a lot of concern and encourages illicit circulation of weapons, which of course are used not only in perpetuating conflict, but violations of human rights and gender-based violence and all these things. So that's also an important perspective. So I would like to turn to our final panelist before we can open for some questions and discussion. So Ms. Jacqueline Duere from Humanium Medal. Jacqueline leads program and advocacy efforts around peace and development at IM Swedish Development Partner. IM is an international NGO that strives towards full equality and strong democracies and contributes to peaceful societies with its flagship program, Humanium Medal, which I'm sure Jacqueline will elaborate on, and the logic behind this platform and ways for youth to engage in activism against gun violence. So Jacqueline, over to you.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you for having me on this panel. It's really, I think there lays a great strength in envisioning a better world together, and then of course also to discuss how we actually going to make this work. So I think we have heard a lot about the relationship between peace and development that is complex and inseparable. And it's great that we have Agenda 2030 that acknowledges this and really make this linkage, especially in development goal 16, but also in the rest of the goals. And I want to highlight today, focus on violence committed with small arms and light weapons, gun violence. And I want to quickly just highlight 3 of the main issues we're dealing with, because while for many of us here, maybe it is obvious why gun violence is an issue, I can say that very often we are asked by people, why do you even care about guns? As a development organization, why would you try to work against gun violence? So I just want to highlight 3 things. And one, we have heard that many people are killed on a daily basis. So we have 600,000 people that are killed violently. That's a figure from 2017. And the vast majority of these, more than 400,000, they're actually killed in non-conflict settings. And I think that is very important to highlight, because it's really important for us to end conflict, but we also need to look at non-conflict settings and the violence that is there on a daily basis. And so of them, again, half of these homicides are committed with firearms. So a lot of people are killed on a daily basis with guns around the world. And the second aspect I want to highlight is gender-based violence. We know that a gun at home increases the likelihood of a deadly outcome of domestic violence. And I think that is especially worrisome, since we know that domestic violence is increasingly sharply everywhere. Really, we see this globally, that the home is becoming more and more insecure during the pandemic. And we also see in some contexts, such in the US, that gun sales are actually spiking. And that's a really, really dangerous mix. And of course, then there's also the fact that guns are also used in facilitating and assisting a lot of crimes, including sexualized violence. And I want to cite an activist, a trans activist that we work with, Amalia. She was part of a paper that we have recently published on gender-based violence and gun violence. And when she shared an experience of sexual assault, she said, if it wasn't for the weapon, maybe I could not have fought back, but at least I could have run away. And I think that really exemplifies how guns facilitate a wide range of crimes, such as sexual assault. And the third issue I want to highlight, especially now during the pandemic, is the survivors of armed violence. We have millions of people living with firearm-induced injury worldwide, and many of the survivors, they actually have to live with lifelong disabilities. And what we see, for example, in context of Central America, is they're often hiding the cause of the injury because they're afraid of being associated with organized crime groups. Because there's this idea that if you were shot by a gang, then for some reason you have deserved it. So you must be involved in criminal activity. And especially now in the pandemic, we see that people with disabilities were among the first to lose their income source. If they had one, they were the ones that lose government subsidies, and the situation really became much more difficult. And I want to share the example of Daniel, who is from San Salvador and whom I had the honor to meet. He's working with our partner organization, Redes Sobrevivientes, and he was shot on his payday on his way home. And he's now disabled from the waist down. He has a 13-month-old daughter, and he was left alone with his daughter after he was shot. And he was lucky that his mother stepped in to support them. And what he said was that the most difficult part of managing his disability was a mental burden that came with it. The fear that this will happen again, he will be violated again, the feeling of being inadequate, and the difficulty of navigating his everyday life. Like many others, as I shared, he actually did not speak about the traumatic experience, but mainly tried to hide himself from people around him. So that's quite a bleak picture. And as Kirsten said, we should not only stand there with the doom, but we should also actually look at what can we do and instill hope. So I'm just going to speak about what we're actually doing to tackle both the root causes of violence and taking the gun out of the equation so that the impact of violence is reduced. In short, IAM has launched Humanium Metal, as Catherine mentioned, and that's basically a peace medal that is won by destroying seized and collected illegal, obsolete weapons. And these weapons are fully destroyed in partnerships with the relevant government authorities, and that's very important. Olamide spoke a bit about the diversion of guns, and we see that illegal guns that are seized end up in the wrong hands again. They go from one illegal hand to one, or from one conflict to another. And so it's very important that we manage stockpiles and that we actually timely destroy weapons. So we're basically taking the guns out of the equation. And then the metal of this weapon destruction is upcycled actually in a range of products. So we have watches, and you can see some of the product in the permanent exhibition on Disarmament at the UNHQ once you can visit them again. Their bracelets, pen, and whatsoever. And we don't stop there. Basically, the income generated goes back to development programs that tackle the root causes of violence, such as violence prevention efforts with youth and affected communities, advocacy efforts on the local, national level. And we also support, via partner organizations, survivors of gun violence with, for example, livelihood interventions and peer group support. So I told you about Daniel, and he's enrolled in a livelihood program run by our partner, Redes Sobrevivientes, and he learned how to be a blacksmith, a trade he can do even in a wheelchair. And I think what he said, the most important actually, was that he met other survivors of gun violence and shared his story with them and overcame this fear of repercussion, of being rejected. And this was really the way to healing for him. And you see, Humanium Metal is a circular business model. Basically, you know, the guns are destroyed, the metal is donated by the governments, then sold to businesses. So they are involved in really different role than the usual CSR, because they basically just do the usual sales of and marketing of products. And that means we also reach a really different target group. There are a lot of people that, just Google nice watches and then learn about gun violence now with this model. And I think that's really the strong suit of it. But since we're also talking about money today, I think it's important to say, basically, yes, we need civic engagement to ensure political will, and we really need much more of this, and we need the young generation and their voices. But we also need new approaches to ensure that we can put the money where the money needs to be put. And I think youth plays a key role here, really. And we constantly try new ways to engage with people, and especially youth. We have heard a bit about the barriers that there are. And one certainly is that disarmament feels technical, far away, difficult to connect, and also that ways of engagement feel like you require a long CV. So we have built an activist platform, Humane Metal Activist Platform, and I'm happy to share the link later. So that's an online platform in which you can learn more about the relationship between gun violence and sustainable development goals. You can get inspired to engage in activism against gun violence, and also to connect to relevant actors in the field, both on the local, regional, and global level. And you can also take concrete action by, for example, sending a petition to your government on weapon destructions. And the site has just been launched in 7 languages. So I'd really like to encourage you to stay in touch with us. We have regular campaigns and events that actually have a youth focus. And I also really would like to encourage you to really challenge the status quo, and basically also challenge us that are always saying the same things at the same fora. Think outside the box. I think the world is obviously in quite a difficult spot at the moment, and we really need your voices and your engagement so we can make this work, basically one destroyed gun at a time. I will stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Thanks very much for that call to action, which I think is a great way to wrap up the panel. And I also wanted to underscore what you said about the number of gun violence and deaths related to gun violence in non-conflict settings, which is an important point and is a striking statistic, because it means that gun violence is a pervasive problem in all regions of the world, and that it's not limited just to places where, in quotes, wars are happening. And in fact, levels of gun violence are significantly higher in places where there isn't considered a conflict, where sometimes it can be harder to then get policy action and to get interventions because there's not, in quotes, a conflict occurring. So that's a very important point. And also wanted just to say that Humanium Metal is an excellent and very innovative program. And we've actually gotten one of the watches for one of our previous colleagues as a parting gift. So it's really was, it's a wonderful program. And I encourage you to have a look at the webpage and see the kinds of work that they're doing. So with this, we finished the panel, and thank you very much. I see Sue shared the link, which is great. And she also invited some questions to be put in the chat. I see one has just come in. I need to have a look at it. I see some more are coming through. So maybe we will start. It would be helpful if you could direct your question to a particular panelist. If not, I would have to just open it up for any of the 4 of you to take it up. So I see the first one. Let's see, this might just be a yes, I think that's just a comment from Ursula. So thank you for that. Regarding a question, what if we are going to compare gun violence in conflict and non-conflict settings? Okay, so maybe that's something that Jacqueline, you could comment on. So comparison of that that, the type of violence. And then I see this from Jim. Speaker said a lot about challenging the status quo. Can they mention difficulties they've personally had? So that sounds like a question for all the panelists. So maybe Jacqueline, I'll hand over to you to answer the question about conflict versus non-conflict.
Yeah, definitely. So I want to say that, of course, statistics are hard to combine, and I think we are all really relying on Small Arms Survey, who are champion in really giving us important information and statistics. I think that it's important to mention that, of course, in conflict settings, it's even more difficult to have reliable numbers. But what we see is that from when we look at the number from 2017, we had 600,000 violent deaths, and of these 400,000 were in non-conflict settings. So that's a huge amount that happened in non-conflict settings. That, of course, doesn't mean that it's not important to also look into the conflict settings, because there are also, of course, other ways of and other damages than just the death numbers. It's just that I think death numbers are the most reliable statistic we have.
Thanks very much. Yes, I would say that Small Arms Survey indeed has excellent statistics. I don't know if there are any colleagues on the call at the moment, but we can find the link and perhaps for the database and share it in the chat. So the other question I think is for all the panelists, talking about personally difficulties they've had in challenging the status quo. So who would like to take that up first? Please jump in.
I can go ahead and share if that's all right.
Thanks.
First of all, thank you, Jim, for that thoughtful question. So I guess for me, part of what's been personally difficult in this journey of trying to weave artistic expression and policy research is that I think from the get-go, a lot of people don't think that the two go together. Creativity and hard policy research seem antithetical because one is abstract and the other isn't. But I think now it's, especially with young people expressing themselves on social media, especially during a pandemic where there aren't a lot of outlets to engage, we're beginning to see the utility of harnessing that form of medium to communicate information and engage. And I would just take this opportunity to note how much I think it was Olamide's point about state security and human security, because that also is a friction that when I work with youth who are somewhat or sort of interested in nuclear policy work, it's really difficult to ask a lot of them who come from low income backgrounds to think about security from the state level, because the first thing that comes to mind is their families and their environments and their communities. And I think that there isn't language readily available for them to thread the through line that connects the global from the local. And this is where I think, again, speaking on behalf of Reverse Trend and a lot of the education and artistic work that we're doing, is that we're trying to use creativity as a medium to connect that through or establish that through line, to make that connection and to see themselves in spaces of power. Because oftentimes that's not even something that they understand is a position that they can potentially be in. And I guess the last thing I'll point out is the importance of this kind of work for skill building. You know, it might be the case that a lot of the youth engagement solutions that we've come up with, you know, maybe some of these young people won't become experts in nuclear policy or non-proliferation of small arms and light weapons. But I think that there is something that they can, the fact that we're investing in their future, whatever that future may be them becoming doctors or teachers or scientists. I think that in of itself is a really effective counter to a world of conflict, right? Because we're giving them an alternative path that is more positive than what currently exists. So that's a lot of thoughts, but I'll just stop there.
Thanks, lovely. Very, very useful. Does anybody else want to come in on that question before we move to the next?
Yeah, I can also comment on it. I think I'd like to share a discussion we had as a humanitarian disarmament community, and that was a focus on anti-racism and feminism, where we identified that one of the main challenges we have in making this discourse more inclusive is that it is really heavily dominated by technical language, and somehow it often feels that you are only perceived as an expert if you have military background or massive technical knowledge. Whereas one could argue that views affected in communities, as, for example, Lovely mentioned, should be as eligible to speak as experts, for example. And I want to share actually something an activist with Gun Free South Africa shared on a similar panel we organized, Maria Nobel, because she said something that echoes what Alameda said earlier. Well, thank you for inviting us as youth to the table, but you actually have to listen to us if you want to change this. And I think that is really one of the issues we're having. We have become better to invite youth to the table, but are they actually listened to?
Thank you. Kirsten, I think you wanted to come in as well. Did you want? Yep.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll just share, a brief thought on that. I think a big part of, especially being a young person involved in this work, is that when you're talking with the general public, the general community about issues like disarmament or peace and security, I find it really makes people uncomfortable. And I think that is something that is actually very difficult to overcome, that when you're talking about big issues of social change, people like to tune in to kind of a small feature like, yeah, absolutely, I support abolition of nuclear weapons, or I support this, I support that. And you talk about kind of what it means or the deep effects of it, and it makes people uncomfortable. And that is a huge barrier at times, because it's hard to feel like you're really making a difference when people don't really feel like they want to listen. My own personal experience with that is when I worked in Greece. I was in a refugee camp there for 6 weeks. I came back, I worked at a very wealthy country club in Toronto, and people would ask what I did in my, the few months before I started working there, and I'd share with them, and more often than not, people would just walk away because it's uncomfortable to hear about the circumstances that we as a global community contribute to. So I think that is something that is difficult with challenging the status quo, and a lot of it comes down to needing to gauge whether people actually want to make a difference, or they want to just kind of contribute to that performative activism. I think once you recognize that there are people who want to make that difference, it helps to deal with those who really are kind of trying to engage at a really surface level versus those who are really digging deeper. And finding the ones who want to dig deeper is absolutely key. But making that distinction can be really difficult, especially when you're excited about something and people really just respond in a way that you don't expect. Yeah.
Thanks.
I'd like to just add some remarks on this particular question. I did sort of ponder upon whether I should espouse these views, but I thought, what the heck, it's the truth. So I'm 28 years old, I'm Nigerian, of course, I'm African, and I work in a space where we talk about nuclear policy, nuclear politics. And this is a space that has been predominantly reserved for old white men. The ideas that have proliferated, what is considered logic, what is considered rational, is seen to be the preserve of this particular subset of people. And so I've come to discover that identity plays a huge role in access to the disarmament community. And from my point of view, I've faced quite a lot of obstacles with regards to even being heard, as Jacqueline pointed out, having your ideas being taken seriously. But I found out that, you know, I'm not alone in this particular conundrum. We've been running a webinar series at Scrap Weapons called Feminist Leadership and Disarmament. And this webinar series, you know, has two aims: to first of all highlight the achievements and the groundbreaking progress that has been spearheaded by women in the disarmament field and non-proliferation field. But the second function of this webinar series is to offer a space where people can be candid about the practical barriers to progress. And, you know, without a doubt, every single participant who has come onto this webinar series has had, you know, numerous examples where there's been either structural, practical, or interpersonal barriers to them being able to, you know, espouse their views and push forward ideas that are very relevant, much needed in the field. So I think, you know, that is definitely one of the barriers: identity. And, you know, we need people that look like you and think like you and have the same exposure to threats as you do, to represent your ideas in places where policy is being made, so that that policy reflects your existence as a person. A second reflection I have on this issue has to do with challenging the status quo. So I was involved with a protest called the End SARS movement in Nigeria. And this was after the shooting down of peaceful protesters by government forces in Nigeria. And I very quickly learned that, you know, if you are going to challenge the status quo, you have to be aware that you'd be exposed to different ways in which states would try to silence your opinion. You know, throughout December, my Twitter account was the subject of numerous trolls attacking my identity and credibility as a researcher. And I found that, you know, these Twitter bots were reserved for this explicit purpose for anybody who tried to challenge the status quo or tried to talk about the End SARS movement online. And this is something that a lot of activists face. And there's a lot of emotional labor that comes with being exposed to that sort of thing. And I think that if you're going to challenge the status quo and if you're going to be an activist, you do have to be prepared for this, and you do have to be transparent with your friends, family, and colleagues, so that you can access the sort of support, the mental and emotional support that you need to be able to carry on doing the work that you're doing. I'll pause there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for your candor. And you know, I think this is important, our personal experiences and who we are and what we bring to the table. So that's very useful. So we have two questions. I mean, there are some other resources and reflections being shared, but there are two specific questions, and I'm mindful of the time. So I think after these two questions, we'll have to wrap up. But the question is from Vanessa. It's, while she completely supports youth having opportunities to get involved, she wonders if youth are becoming a bit overburdened, which is valid. So the question is how can youth be a conduit to also engage adults for disarmament, and what strategies could be used to convey that urgency? And the second question I will also raise is from Ashanafi, who would like to learn if there are law enforcement actions somewhere in the convention articles against the army violence actors on GBV and innocent killing at different circumstances. So I guess the question is law enforcement mechanism with regards to relevant conventions. Which is more of a very specific legal question, but if any colleagues would like to respond to that, or the question about overburdening the youth, the generation, which I can understand.
I can jump in as an overburdened youth. As mentioned in my bio, you know, I'm heading into my fourth year university. I have a dog. I have a pandemic. Like there's lots of things, and that's everyone I think nowadays feels a lot of that pressure. So I definitely feel there's a big emphasis towards engaging adults. And I think a lot of it is, again, where I mentioned you have to meet people where they're at with what they're passionate about. So I think a big thing that, we hear arguments either for or against weapons programs is the impact on taxes, the impact on money coming out of citizens' pockets, and where that money could be better spent. So again, I think it is a lot of working with people, let's say community advocates. Here in my city, there's a really big push for community childcare centers and a really specific push for the fact that there's a large police budget and not a large childcare center budget. And I think that absolutely fits into this conversation around disarmament and advocating for more appropriate use of resources. So meeting people where they're at in that sense and bringing them into a larger conversation. So that's one community, one city example, but it can be brought into a larger scale. And it's just really finding people's passions and connecting them to a larger issue, which is what advocacy and activism work is really all about, in my opinion.
Thanks, Kirsten. And maybe on the legal framework question, just a general remark that, the arms control area has several legal frameworks, the gender-based violence area. So I apologize if I don't understand fully your question, but there's also principles on regulating the use of force by law enforcement. So we do have legal frameworks. We do have multilaterally negotiated principles and norms and standards that are set that can be leveraged. And that is, I think, part of the toolbox that youth can use, when they advocate. But it's important to also bring it down to a personal level, like what Lovely and others have talked about in terms of using art and using topics of conversation that really resonate with people, that sometimes big treaties and conventions don't always do the trick, so to say. But it's definitely a part of the toolbox to make us understand that there are also commitments that your governments have made, like the Arms Trade Treaty, which Olamide has referenced. And so that's sort of part of the advocacy toolbox. So I'm mindful of the time, so I want to open the floor to the panelists for any very short closing remarks. And I also want to welcome Ambassador Chan, Maritza, if you'd like to say anything in closing. Thank you very much for staying with us. I know you're very busy. Costa Rica is extremely active here at UNHQ, so you have a lot of things to do. So let me just maybe go in reverse order just for the panelists, and I'll start with Jacqueline just for a few brief closing elements. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the discussion. I'm happy to see the interest here, and I think that it is really important that we have to get better at how can we engage people, how can we engage youth without actually putting an additional burden, and as Olamide said, unpaid burden to them. And I think that we as organization are definitely always looking for new ways of doing things. So we're very happy for any suggestions also on how we can engage better on our platform.
Thank you. Olamide?
Well, thank you so much for having me on this wonderful panel. I think my final remarks would really be to just recognize the progress that is being made. 2 years ago, we didn't have a specialized youth for disarmament organization that is really beginning to open up the space for young people from very young ages to be able to reasonably engage. And I think this is a step in the right direction. And I'd really want to see a lot more active support for this initiative from state parties, as we've seen with the leadership of Costa Rica and Korea and other countries. So yeah, I'm very optimistic about the future, especially when we have young, diverse voices talking about what they would like to see become a reality. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that dash of optimism. It's important because we can't just be overwhelmed. We also need to be optimistic. Kirsten, go ahead.
Yeah, no, thank Thank you so much for having me. I think this has definitely been an optimistic talk and really has helped to solidify the fact that youth are leading it. They will change the world, whether we want to be along for the ride or not. So might as well get on board. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the videos that come through at this challenge. I think they'll be really exciting and have a lot of things to think about on the community level, the national level, and international level. So yeah, really excited about this initiative. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirsten. Thanks for your work too as a youth champion for disarmament. Lovely.
Sure. Again, thank you so much for having me today. It's just incredibly refreshing. Oftentimes when I speak, it's with my nuclear policy hat, and this is one of the first events in which I can actually talk from the creative side of things. So I'm incredibly grateful. I just want to say, to this point about overburdening, I think we being really the older generation have to be mindful of decoupling this notion of involvement with expectation to resolve or come up with a solution. I think oftentimes when we talk about youth and our hope for the youth, unfortunately, sometimes we bake in language that it's about you will resolve all of our problems. And I think that puts that burden on youth as opposed to just being a public citizen participant in all of these issues that we care about. And so that's just a peace offering or a parting gift in addressing that particular question. So again, thank you for having me.
Thanks, Lovely. And Ambassador, would you like to also say a few words in closing?
Thank you, Catherine, for inviting me and to Sue for organizing this event. It's good to see so many familiar faces. My words are of encouraging. I want to encourage you to not give up, to raise the level of ambition, to continue to push us, to make changes, to be better, to live up to the aspirations of the UN Charter. Do not forget that there is an article in the UN Charter that recommends, that suggests, that demands states to invest in socioeconomic development and not on weapons. The tone of these days with the pandemic is very pessimistic, and it shouldn't be so. This is an opportunity to change things and do things better. And who else is going to do that but you? So keep going, never give up, be encouraged. You have partners with certain states to do what is right. And we're here to support you, to offer you opportunities and a voice whenever we can, and never give up. Let's be optimistic. The world can change, and we are part of that movement. I thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Very, very important call to action. And thanks to Costa Rica for always being a champion of disarmament and civil society and ODA. So we appreciate that. So let me just say thank you very much for allowing me to facilitate. Much appreciated. And I would like to turn it over to Sue, who is the mastermind behind this whole event and the Youth and Disarmament Initiative. So it's only appropriate that she gets to close the event. So thank you very much, Sue.
Thank you, Catherine, for moderating today's panel discussion and your kind words. Distinguished participants, please join me in thanking all the speakers for sharing their expertise and experience with a round of virtual applause. Thank you. Now we have reached the end of today's event. I would like to leave with you the single most important thing that each of you can do to help realize our shared common future that is more peaceful, prosperous, and secure. And that is stay informed and spread the word. We need young people around the world to engage and share their perspectives on disarmament and the SDGs. Whether it's sharing something via social media, speaking at an event, or a simple conversation with a friend, movements are built on these moments. I've seen real breakthroughs come in through difficult and uncomfortable conversations. As Leonard Cohen says in his song Anthem, There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. I would like to wrap up today's event by sharing a 2-minute short clip, which is part of a new Intro to Disarmament Explainer video series. This video will help you better understand the vital role disarmament and arms control play in achieving the SDGs. Thank you all for attending today's event.
Disarmament and the Sustainable Development Goals. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, were agreed on by all United Nations member states in 2015. They are a blueprint for all states to work together to achieve a better, more sustainable future by 2030. As development, peace, and security are fundamentally connected, effective disarmament and arms control are vital for achieving these goals. We can see this most obviously in SDG 16 to promote just, peaceful and inclusive societies, with its specific target on significantly reducing illicit arms flows. But disarmament can be found throughout the goals. Armed violence is a leading cause of premature death and a key source of injuries, disability and psychological distress. Raising awareness about disarmament issues through education strengthens the building of peaceful societies. The safe and secure management of arms and ammunition stockpiles improves the safety and resilience of our cities. When disarmament efforts are gender responsive, they recognize the different impacts of weapons on women, men, girls, and boys. Contamination from remnants of war and the testing and use of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons have disastrous environmental consequences. And excessive military spending diverts much needed economic resources, which could be used for sustainable development, peace, and security. When we think of disarmament and arms control in the wider sense of sustainable development, conflict prevention, and peace building, we are better prepared to tackle 21st century challenges and implement the 2030 Agenda.
Thanks, everyone. Until next time. Bye.